What's poppin', everybody? In this video I'm gonna spill the sauce about how to mix your beats and pretty much how you can get your beats to go from sounding like this to this. So if you want to get all the sauce, stay tuned all the way through to the end. But that's enough of the intro, so let's just jump right into the sample. Alright, so starting off with this sample here, I got a few different layers going on. It's pretty much just these 5 layers I got right here. So the first sound is this piano and keyscape that's got some reverb on it. So my brother beatsbytej, he's the one that put down this first melody. So he put down this bass piano pattern in D sharp minor. So anyways, he routed that sound to a mixer track. He threw on some halftime with these settings and turned the mix level down. As for the bass on this, he also rolled off the lows. So for your patterns that are going to have a lot of bass heavy sounds like deeper piano notes or something like a brass or a lower string, a lot of times if you're going to add a sub bass or an 808, usually it's a good idea to roll off the low end, but just enough to where it gets rid of those sub frequencies so they don't really interfere with any of your bass sounds. So next I just have this pad sound. It's pretty simple. This is pretty much just filling in some space that's left from the piano. And then I threw in these 2 accents. And then lastly, I just put down some more bass piano notes. Those bass piano notes are routed to the same mixer track as the original piano melody. So altogether, the sample, fully mixed and everything, sounds something like this. So I'm going to go step by step on usually how I level out and mix my loops. So like I said, the primary melody, I'll usually roll off the low ends. This helps it give a little bit of space for some of the other sounds. A lot of times if the melodies are too harsh in certain frequencies, I'll open up an EQ and I'll use my scroll wheel and put this all the way down to like 0 or 5%. And then I'll just kind of move around in this range, the +6 range or so, and just find frequencies that I think don't really fit the rest of the melody. Or if I want to cut out a certain part and make room for another sound, I'll cut it in this one and go to that similar frequency range in the other sound and boost it. So for example, let's say we want to take something that's about 650 hertz and we want to cut it out of this melody. So we'll take this and just scroll it down until we have a decent dip. And let's say we want to emphasize that frequency in the pad. So what I'm going to do is open up an EQ on the pad and go to that same frequency range, which is about 630 or 640, and boost it just a little bit in that same spot. Pretty much the exact same thing as the last one, except for emphasizing in this one. Oftentimes, I personally don't like boosting the EQs like this unless I really need to emphasize that sound. As for certain things like the accents or higher one shots, sometimes you'll have harsher frequencies in like the really high and treble regions, and you might want to put a high cut just to cut that out. So lastly, for my sub bass, I usually get bass sounds. They usually have a decent amount of mid and high end to them. That way they stick out a little bit more in the mix. I also don't feel the need to keep raising the level in the mix, which overall just creates a more balanced sample. So now for the actual leveling, usually for the primary melodies, you want it to stick out the most. You want it to carry most of the weight in the mix. You don't want it to be too quiet and you don't want it to be too loud. Me personally, I try to keep it around -12, and something like that's just personal preference. It doesn't really matter too much as long as you're not going too high or too low. The next sound after that I'll usually move on to is my sub bass. At the very most, I'd want it 3 decibels louder than the last sound. So for example, in this sample, my primary melody caps out at about -12 dB, so my sub bass at most should cap out around -9. As for the other things like my pads and ear candy and whatnot, that really just comes down to how loud I feel like it needs to sound relative to the other ones, so you really have to use your ears on things like those. Typically they are quieter both sound wise and visually in the loudness meter. When it comes to the melodics, a lot of it really boils down to what types of sounds you're using and what frequency ranges they take up. And a lot of that just comes with playing around with it and just figuring it out by ear over time and just practicing. And also, if you are going to change the pitch of your sample while you're making it, your EQs will also have to change for each individual sound. Unless you do something like I did on this one, where I went to the master track and I put the sound shifter on. So what it does is it takes all the sounds going into the master, which is pretty much all the stems from the loop. This way you don't have to to adjust the EQs accordingly if you pitch it up or down. It's already accounted for since it's pitching all the stems after they've been routed through the EQ. So just a quick little tip, it'll make your mixes sound a little bit cleaner down the road. Once I had that, I rendered this out and I stuck it into my drums template. So here we got the drums template pulled up. Usually what I'll do is I'll make all my drums in one pattern, and then I'll just right click on it and then hit split by channel, and then it'll come up with all these different patterns, and I'll arrange the beat and whatnot. Once I have all that, I already have my drums template. Every time I drag in a drum sound, I just drag it into each individual channel. So I already have a preset channel for the 808s, clap, hi-hats, etc. If you don't already have all your sounds routed to the mixer track, a quick way you could do that is you go to the channel rack, you go to these select bars right here next to each of the sounds, just right click and drag all your sounds, and then when you go to the mixer rack, select a track and then hit Control Shift L, and it'll take all your sounds and route them all to a mixer track in sequence. So I've already got mine set and mixed and everything here. I'll just take you through my process of mixing it. Before I get into that though, I generally have two different processes of mastering my beats, but the leveling is the same for both of them. So I'll go over the leveling and then I'll explain my mastering. So for most beats, I usually start with the 808s, and I'll just go to the mixer track and just solo it using right click and just let it play. So for beats like this where I don't have a kick, I usually like to have the 808 sit between -3 and 0 without it going over 0. I'll also put up a screenshot of the different levels that each of the sounds usually sit in. And again, these are not all set in stone. I usually adjust them as I need to with the rest of the beat. Next, I'll usually move on to the clap and the snare. So for this beat, my clap and snares are merged on the third beat of every measure. But on a normal beat where I just have either one or the other hitting on every third beat, what I'll do is I'll usually level it between -9 and -6 dBs. So for this beat, I tried to make the snare just a little bit louder than the clap, just because the snare hits on off beats without the clap, so I want it to be a little bit more prominent. So I panned the clap a little bit to the left, and I panned the snare just a little bit to the right. And both of these hit at around -9 dB. The clap might be a little bit less. Usually what I'll do here, I'll just enable both the clap and the snare, and I'll go to the master and just let it run. And usually I try to get this to be around -6 when they're both combined together. This is a little bit louder, but that'll be okay just for the sake of the beat and all the different sounds I got going with it. So after I got those first 3 sounds mixed, I then move on to my hi-hats. Typically, I'll keep my hi-hats panned to the left. Sometimes I'll have it more towards the right. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll go into Patcher and I'll go into the 1K auto pan preset, and I'll take this knob and move it between this region right here. And then what I'll do is I'll go back to the mixer track and move it down to about like 20%. After leveling out the hi-hats, I'll move on to the open hats. So visually, these are usually the quietest sound throughout the entire mix. This is just because the high end really cuts through the mix really easily. So I try not to make these super loud. In this particular beat, I kept it really quiet. So I kept it around like -18. For me, they'll usually range between like -21 and -15. As for the perk, it's more or less the same thing. And the open hat, I usually try to pan it in the opposite direction of my hi-hats. So in this case, the hi-hats are more panned to the left. So my open hats are going to be more panned to the right. And it'd be the other way around. If my hi-hats were panned more to the right, my open hats would be more panned to the left. My next sound that I'm leveling out is the perk. And visually this looks really loud, but in the overall mix, it doesn't cut through that much. Going back to that same principle of you want to mix more with your ears than you do your eyes, the visual level that you see is more of just like a general guideline of where you want the sound to be, and then all the fine tuning, you have to use your own judgment to figure it out. But anyways, that's pretty much all the sounds I have for this beat. I do want to touch on one thing though, and that's the kick. If you're going to use a kick, especially with something with a spins 808, I personally like to make the kick just a tad louder than the actual 808. So in this example, my 808 sat between like -3 and 0. I would probably have the 808 sit just a little bit under -3 and have the kick hit between -3 and 0. That way the kick just gives it that extra punch. You could also do it the other way around. Honestly, it just comes down to personal preference. So after I mix all the drums, I give it one last listen through for about 8 measures. So if I want to go through and make any adjustments to it, any more fine tuning, it's easier to do it now with the drums, now that I have all the leveling pretty much done. So once I have all that, then I'll turn the loop channel back on and I'll mix it with the loop. So usually what I like to do is start it low and move it back up, and I'll slowly keep moving it up until I feel like it's at a good point where I can stop and it fits well with the rest of the drum sounds. Now that I got that down, I've only got a few different sounds to finish out my leveling. So the remainder of these sounds that I want to mix are like my tag and the transitions. So similar to the other sounds, I'll just route them to the mixer track by hitting Ctrl-Shift-L. Usually I don't set up a baseline for these visually. These are usually just leveled out outside of the mixer track using the volume knob, or I'll just leave it at whatever it was when I opened my template.
Roll up, Tess.
So again, for these sounds, I would say just use your own ear, use your discretion. If they sound way too loud and overpowering, they probably are. So now that we got all of the leveling done, I'm gonna move on to my master techniques, but I'm gonna start off with the first one, which uses one third-party plugin. So in both of these techniques, I open up an EQ, and usually I'd keep these levels about the same. So the band 7 or the one all the way on the end here, I put it up by 2 scroll clicks or boost it by 3.2 decibels. The one next to it goes up by a little under 1 decibel. The second band over here goes up by 1 scroll wheel click, which is 1.6 decibels. Then I'll just put on a default soft clipper, which helps kind of get rid of that distorted or overly punchy sound that comes from the 808. And so those first two effects are the same in both of my methods. This is where the two methods deviate a little bit. So then I'll open up this RVox stereo compressor. I'll first start by adjusting this gate. Usually I'll keep it somewhere in this region here. As for the actual compression, I'll just adjust it to how I feel like it's needed. So I'll just start out with 0 and just keep slowly dragging it down. It's pretty loud already, so what I'm gonna do is turn this gain down by quite a bit and give myself some headroom for the last effect. You'll be able to see on the master track, I have it capped out at about -6 dB. Now that I've given myself that headroom, I move on to my last effect, which is Maximus on the Master Aid 1 preset. Without any changes, it sounds like this. So that's cool and all, but it's a little bit too loud and you can hear the plugins actively soft clipping it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start by going to the bands here. I'm gonna lower the high end a little bit and the low end some more and take this high down just a little bit more. Turn that low up a little bit. So I just went in and made the necessary changes that I wanted to with the 3 different bands. And then what I'll do is I'll switch it back to the monitor and switch this down to off. And the 2 things I'm going to be looking at are this blue post knob right here and the loudness level on the master. And I want this to get just above 0 or around 0. I don't want it to be too high or too low. So I'm just going to keep adjusting that blue knob until it gets to where I want it to be. So now that I got it just above 0, I'm gonna move it back to comp off. So this is sounding just a little bit quiet, so I'm just gonna move this post knob up just a little bit, but not to the point where it gets super distorted like it was before. So that pretty much concludes the first mastering technique. The second one is using all stock plugins. So like I said before, we're gonna have the same EQ preset and the default soft clipper, except this time I'm gonna open up a multi-band compressor instead of the other one. And what I'm gonna do is go down to the mastering 2.4 dB preset. I'm gonna reset the gain to 0 and just leave the limiter on. After the multi-band compressor, I'll go into the limiter. I know there's a lot of people that don't like fruity limiter, but just hear me out on this one. What you want to do is go down to this envelope section and you want to turn all these knobs all the way to the left. You want to turn them completely off. The only 3 knobs you want to focus on are these loudness knobs, the gain, saturation, and the ceiling. With this technique, I just keep the ceiling where it's at because I don't want the gain to get too high where it starts spilling past my 0 dB ceiling, so usually I'll just leave that as is. So with this gain knob, I'm gonna try to move the peaks of my mix here as close as I want to this line without it going well over it. Usually that just ends up being 1 scroll wheel tick up, and I'll take the saturation knob and just adjust it to my liking to how distorted I want my 808s to sound. it seems a little bit more on the louder side. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go back to my multiband compressor and I'm gonna turn the gain down by about 1.5 decibels. And then going back to the limiter here, I'm gonna go and reset my saturation and fix my gain and do that again. So I'm going to show y'all before and after, before leveling any of the sounds or anything, and an after of what it sounds like once again.
Reluctant.
Alright, so that's gonna do it for me. Hope y'all found this video pretty helpful. I got a multi-kit out with my boy Double M right now. Go check that out. Link will be in the description. And I got a new one on the way, so stay tuned for that. Anyways, that's gonna wrap it up for this one, and I'll see y'all in the next video.